All right. So one of the big things that I want to see coming is something that's called right to work. A lot of people don't understand what that means. So do you want to give us a little recap?
Well, in Minnesota, we have basically forced unionism, Sue, which means if it's a closed shop type of workplace, in that whether you're talking about a public workplace in a public employer like, say, the Department of Natural Resources, or federally, they actually require the same type of approach in the private workplace, and that means that if your workplace has voted in the past to become a union, if the employees have voted to become a union, every employee is a compulsory union member. In other words, they are forced to pay the union dues, which are significant withdrawals from their paychecks, either pay the union dues or fair share, which basically means 85 or 90% of union dues. You can pay those, but then you don't get health insurance and some other things through your union. But so what Right to Work does, and incidentally, there are 22 states in the U.S. that have right to work, almost half. And a good number of them have right to work in their constitutions. I think it's 8 or 9. About half of those have right to work in their constitution. And we are proposing it here in Minnesota, and I introduced the bill last session. It's House File 65. What it would do is it would provide a measure up to place it on the ballot for the voters, to give them the ability to adopt right to work here in Minnesota. We call it freedom of employment, employee freedom, if you will, which gives the worker the ability and the freedom to decide whether or not they want to become a union member. It does nothing about the collective bargaining process. The union can still collectively bargain with their employer, but not everyone has to become part of the union, and that can be significant for people. We're looking at some of these professional folks who are members of unions. They're paying $600, $700, $800 a year in dues. So if we can have right to work or freedom of employment adopted by the voters here in Minnesota, that could be a significant increase in wages for those folks. And we need to move towards freedom of association in the marketplace.
So it's clear you must hate unions.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. The other part about this is it's a two-way freedom. It not only does it allow workers the freedom to decide whether or not they want to join a union, but it also says to employers that you cannot decide to not hire somebody because they have outwardly said that they want to be a member of a union. So it's a two-way freedom. This is all about freedom, freedom of association, freedom for people to direct their future according to our U.S. Constitution. So really that's what it's about, and the people in Minnesota are really getting excited about this from what I've been hearing out there, some of the polling data we've seen. So I'm excited to see if we can bring this forward and place it on the ballot for the people in Minnesota.
So there are public unions and private unions. Does this apply to both?
It does, yes. Yep, it would apply to all unions in the state of Minnesota, and again, it's been passed in other states. And
I think Scott Walker in Wisconsin just signed Wisconsin, which means we're surrounded. If you look at the map, everyone around us is a right-to-work state except for the state of Minnesota.
The two Dakotas, Iowa, and now Wisconsin, Sue. So it's us and Ontario, eh?
Yes.
So we are finding ourselves surrounded, and not only that, the important thing about this, we need to remember the strength about right to work or freedom of employment. The good thing about it is that the job creation that evolves out of states that have freedom of employment happens at a rate of 2 times that of states that do not. And so we look back in history and we can look at different periods of years, and it's very evident, not only job creation, but in a variety of other economic measures. We're seeing that it's a great thing for the worker, it's a great thing for business, it's a great thing for the overall economy. This is a huge jobs bill that will become, that if we can get it placed on the ballot, and I have no doubt that people in Minnesota will pass it if it's placed on the ballot. If that happens, this will be the biggest job creation strategy that the state legislature in Minnesota could do.
Why do you think it has to be placed on the ballot?
Well, some of that is self-evident. We have we have a governor in Minnesota that is a very strong friend of unions. He worked very closely with unions through the election, and as a matter of fact, he and when we talk about unions with right to work, and we can go into some of the numbers later, but really union members are in favor of this. It's the union bosses that are opposed to right to work because they're afraid of losing their command and control and political power.
And money.
And money, and that's where the political power comes from. But that political power certainly was exercised last election between, especially AFSCME and MAPE and the public unions and our governor. So he's reluctant to sign any statutory measure that would bring freedom of employment around. As a matter of fact, he vetoed many reforms around labor last session as part of our reforms in Reform 1.0. So anyway.
So we already have at least one constitutional amendment question on the ballot. Can you ever have too many? Is it a good idea to have multiple questions on the ballot? And any other questions that you think might be added onto the ballot as well?
Well, I would suspect you can have too many. As a matter of fact, I have seen a past piece from Minnesota House Research that has done the research around the correlation between the number of ballot measures that are placed out there for the people and the probability with which, or the correlation, I should say correlation is probably the right term, with which they may be passed at that point. And we find, as we look back, those years in which there were 2, 3, or 4 ballot measures placed on the ballot had significantly greater success than either 1 or 5 or any greater than 5. So I would guess it's going to be 2, 3, or 4. I certainly know that we're looking at photo ID might be one we might end up placing on the ballot.
Thank goodness. 80% of the state of Minnesota wants photo ID. I don't know what Mark Dayton's thinking of. He vetoed that one as well.
It does, and I'll tell you that freedom of employment, Sue, it's approaching 75%. We're over 70% support in Minnesota for the freedom of employment language, at least an abbreviated form of what we have in House File 65. So I'm very confident, again, if this gets placed on the ballot, as with photo ID, that there are going to be 2 that Minnesotans would like to see guide the future of their state.
So if we have 3 ballot questions on our ballot when we go in November of 2012, are we going to turn into California?
Well, we certainly are not. California's got initiative and referendum, and the people can form groups in order to go around. And
that's a big difference.
It's
Initiative and referendum versus a constitutional question on the ballot.
Here in Minnesota, what we need to do is the legislature needs to pass a proposal through both houses. The governor does not get a chance to sign or veto it. It goes directly to the ballot, but it is completely different. I should mention this, too. I expect we're going to see some sort of measure entertained around either limiting the ability of the legislature to raise taxes or to spend, and that would be the other one that is in the mix. But before we go,
I want to ask you about the possibility of limiting the spending or tax increases or whatever. Are you talking about a taxpayer bill of rights?
Maybe something like Tabor, but also maybe we've talked about maybe making a supermajority requirement to raise taxes, or maybe a supermajority to spend. Maybe Governor Plenty's idea of not being able to spend more than you took in the previous biennium. Those are the types of ideas we're looking at around there.
Very good ideas.
Good stuff. So those are the 4 ideas probably that are most prevalent. I should mention the polling that has been done around this freedom of employment question. And Public Opinion Strategies has done 2 very significant polls in the last 6 months, one in July, one recently in early December. And they have found that freedom of employment or right to work back in July had about 68% support in the state. The most recent one in December has 73% for the actual language that would or could appear on the ballot. That means 69% of union members, 69% of union members would like the freedom of employment. So we really need to work forward to bring them this freedom and bring this forward for Minnesota and our economic future.
That's an unbelievable number, 69%.
Exactly.
I mean, we've just got to get this done. So if there's that much overwhelming support for this legislation, why can't we convince Mark Dayton, pass it through the legislature and convince Mark Dayton this is a good idea? Is he just too tied to the unions?
I really don't know. I just know what I see, and the behavior I see in the governor is that he seems to have an allegiance to the unions that won't allow him to go there. And
so he must have an allegiance to the union leadership,
union
not
leadership.
necessarily to the union
Exactly,
members.
Exactly. He's leaving the union members out of the equation and focusing on the leadership. And that political power, again, is exercised by that leadership, and I'm sure they're going there. But you raise a good point. I think I would like to and you know, sit down with the governor and talk about these numbers and things we're seeing and let them know, you know what, union members are in favor of this. We need to give them the opportunity to decide whether they want the freedom or not to join that union.
I just find that incredible.